Welcome back to the Unlock Your Potential podcast. I'm Matt Faupel, founder of FaupelX, and this is where we get real about commercial real estate leadership and operations. If you're a property manager or a CRE leader who wants to scale smarter, build trust with ownership, and lead with precision, you're in the right place. And today we're tackling one of the most stressful, but also most important parts of the year, budget season. Now, let me be straight with you. Budgets aren't just about the numbers, they're about credibility, they're about trust, and they're about whether ownership sees you as a strategic partner or just an expense manager. So in this episode, I'm breaking down the strategies that have helped me not just survive budget season, but actually use it as a way to stand out as a leader. Now, here's the first mindset shift I want you to have. Your budget isn't just paperwork, it's an annual performance review. Every line item is ownership asking you, do you really know this building? Are you anticipating problems? Or are you just pushing paper? Budget preparation typically kicks off mid to late summer, ideally with clear timeline that has milestones to ensure nothing is being rushed or overlooked. And that's something I can't stress enough. If you're taking notes, make sure to write this down, is to set internal deadlines weeks ahead of owner deadlines to set you and your team up for success. This is going to provide a buffer for any unforeseen delays, and it lets you review the work carefully as you go along this budget planning season. It's one of those things that a property manager's annual budget is typically split into two parts. So this is something to be mindful of, is that there's an operating budget, which is the day-to-day income and expenses, and then there's the capital budget, which is long-term investments and improvements for the property. It's very important to distinguish these and understand the differences and understand how your ownership wants these items separated. They serve very different purposes, and owners evaluate them differently depending on their goals for their property. The operating budget, OPEX, this covers the property's expected income and operating expenses for the year. Essentially, this is the recurring revenues, the cost to keep the property running on a daily basis. And these are things that you're probably most familiar with, the day-to-day items happening at the property. The capital budget, this covers major investments and one-time projects that improve or extend the life of the property. These are typically beyond the scope of just the daily operations. And capital expenditures are usually depreciated over time, and they often require several layers of approval and consideration because typically they're a higher spend amount. Now, let's be honest. Some property managers, they recycle last year's number, and for some properties that may be acceptable. They'll put on there a 3 to 5% increase, call it a day. But this is something I throw a lot of caution at because ownership can spot that from a mile away. One of the things to keep in mind is that for predictable costs, fine, you can use the percentage increase. Maybe there's something that we know matter of factly this is not changing, whether it's a consumable, whether it's a service, but we know that this is something that we can count on and trust the percentage increased on. But for other things like janitorial, security, amenities, things that are affected by the tenants, by the seasons, by what's going on in the market, these are things that you need to be aware of. What are driving the costs and what's changed year to year and what's changing in the future. A good example of this is a property manager had a situation where janitorial costs had spiked almost 20%. And on the surface, it looked like a big miss for the management team. But when they broke it down, they reflected and looked into the situation, what they realized is that the tenant mix for that property had shifted. There were 3 new restaurants, which meant there was a ton of more trash to pick up. There was overnight cleaning that started to pick up as well. And so it wasn't necessarily a mistake, that it was a reality of what was actually going on. And so once they understood this, they got refamiliarized with what's going on in the evenings and the nighttime with these new restaurants taking up space, and they explained that to ownership. Everything was fine. But this is a big example. This is the difference between someone understanding what's going on day to day and having to be reactive and dive back into things. Lazy budgets create red flags, and strategic budgets build confidence. It's one of those things that we see with variance notes, for example. Variance notes are an opportunity to build trust. For example, a bad variance note could be utilities are over budget due to weather. I mean, It's okay, but a better example would be the utilities exceeded the budget by 8% due to an extended heat wave. We've adjusted our forecast for next year, and we have our vendor reviewing the systems for any efficiency opportunities we can find. This is a great formula to follow. It has the cause, the response, the prevention. This is what I would want to hear if I was the owner. Now, when a property manager does that consistently, and the variance notes are not excuses, they become little strategy sessions. These are things that ownership notices and what stands a property manager out from others. Now, there are a couple items that can be very detrimental to a budget if you're not mindful and aware of what's going on. The first one is going to be utilities. This is something that it's very easy to just roll over last year's number, but this is something you need to be mindful of, looking at the data, rate changes, occupancy trends for the property, and be aware of what's going on in your area with those utility companies. Have a pulse on what's going on. It's very common in most markets that the utility companies, the energy providers, their rate increases are in the headlines. And whether it's a couple percent or several percent, this is something that you can keep an eye on very easily. Another item is repairs and maintenance. Understanding your building, the equipment, the systems, the wear and tear that's occurring. And this goes hand in hand with capital planning. If your equipment is years past its life expectancy, pretending you won't have issues is just wishful thinking. Another item is labor. Wages are continuing to climb, and this is something that you need to have a conversation with ownership over. Explain the risks involved with going to bid for some of your on-site services, for some of your labor. What's the retention risk? What's the security risk? What are the things that your tenants are happy with? There are things to really be mindful of when it's not just chasing the lowest number. What are the costs that'll come with changing out labor and going to bid for different things like that? And an idea and consideration I want everyone to have that's listening, and definitely feel free to write these down, is to consider new technology, new efficiencies that are hitting the market. For example, you talk about janitorial. Well, if the labor rates are continuing to increase, is there an opportunity for an investment or a rental with a cleaning robot to cut down on that labor cost? Is there an opportunity using drones for window washing, power washing? Not only are these methods safer, but typically they're quicker, they're more efficient, and this could have an opportunity for some cost savings in the long run. There's also ideas with creating new revenue streams, from grab and go markets to EV chargers. These are things to consider as you're looking at expenses going up. What are a way to drive those costs? What are a way to balance out those costs with on-site amenities or revenue opportunities? It's one of those things to remember, that your familiarity with this information is extremely important, that data wins arguments, but stories close deals, and you need both of those as you're going into budget season. Now, as we talk about capital projects, this is where you can either build trust or you can blow it. Don't just drop a huge replacement onto ownership and hope for the best. This is something where you need to be very knowledgeable and prepared for these types of conversations. You need to explain what happens if you do nothing. What's the risk? Explain what are the short-term fix options. Here are the costs for those. Here's what could work. Here's what may go wrong. And also acknowledge the full replacement. Here's the payoff in the long term. These are the things that would solve. And this goes hand in hand with understanding what's those ownership groups, what's their goal for the property, what are they planning to do with it, what are their expectations for that on-site experience. These are all things that get wrapped up together as you're going through budget season and capital planning. And as you're having these conversations or exchanging these emails with owners, it's important to remember that they don't necessarily want your 47 tab Excel workbook with all these notes and ideas that you have. They want decision quality information. They want you to present recommendations and understanding of the market, the building, and the items that you're bringing up for them to consider. Budgeting is not just about guessing the future. It's about telling a story that makes ownership understand that you know what's going on at the property, you understand the market, and you understand the equipment and systems to make that property operate at the level that they are hoping for. Now, every seasoned property manager can fall prey to budgeting pitfalls that undermine the effectiveness of a budget. So things to remember, be very mindful. Starting late or rushing the process is a recipe for disaster. Copying last year's budget without any analysis is a recipe for disaster. And mixing operational and capital items. Again, these are not going to set you or your team up for success as you're going through budget season. Now, look, budget season doesn't have to feel like survival mode. It can be a lot of work, but done right, it's your chance to prove that you're not just managing numbers, you're managing the property, you're managing relationships, you're managing the relationship, the reputation of the property. So when you connect the dots between the building, the market, the numbers, you stop being a manager that's getting second guessed by ownership. You become a trusted source of guidance and information to what's actually happening and what are the solutions that ownership can consider as they're evaluating what they want to do with things. Now, that's a wrap on today's episode of Unlock Your Potential. If this episode gave you any clarity or some ideas on budget best practices, please consider sharing it with someone else in commercial real estate. I do want to share that there is a much more in-depth version of this topic on the Unlock Your Potential newsletter on LinkedIn, an incredible resource that I compiled that has best practices, information, things to consider. And even if you're very familiar with budget season and you've done it 100 times, this is an opportunity to kind of reevaluate, remember what works, what doesn't work, and also share with other people things, tips, and advice I wish you had earlier in your career. If you have time, please check out FaupelX.com. There's some links on there to CRE Pro as well. So if you want to use ChatGPT to prepare for your budget season, you have some projects you're trying to figure out how they could work, building systems and equipment that you're not sure when they'll need to be replaced. It's a great tool to consider as you're working through those things. So thank you so much for your time. Until next time, keep pushing forward.